11 to 21. It would be wrong to think that Jeremiah was unaffected by the circumstances in which God had placed him. He endured everything with sorrow, with a degree of fear. He was afraid for his life. Remember, he asked if he could not go back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, which had been turned into a prison, because I will die there. So he knew fear, he knew great tears. And we'll come to some more examples of that in a moment. But as I said, he didn't doubt the righteousness of a sovereign God and the truthfulness of his promises. Neither did he capitulate to his fear or seek other solutions. And some of us need to ponder that when we get into a bit of trouble and we start running around like a scalded cat. I've got to do something, I've got to do something, I'll do this, I'll do that. And really what we need to do is turn back to the Lord and to his word, which is what Judah didn't do. Anyway, that was Jeremiah, steadfast, immovable, abounding in the work of the Lord, to use New Testament language of him. King Zedekiah was the exact opposite. The exact opposite. He seemed to run in several directions all at the same time. He was thoroughly weak. According to 2 Chronicles 36, verses 13 to 17, his sins were first that he refused to humble himself before Jeremiah. How about that? I don't like that man because he always speaks ill of me. Another king said that of a prophet. I don't want to hear him. He never says anything nice. He refused to humble himself before Jeremiah, the servant of the Lord, the prophet by whom God spoke. Secondly, according to 2 Chronicles 36, and only slightly less amazing, he actually rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, against the express instructions of the prophet Jeremiah. The king had put him on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar was his sponsor. And yet he rebelled against him. And thirdly, it says he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against the Lord. And so throughout the 11 years of his so-called reign, he continued to ignore God, ignore God's word, at the same time as craving for some word from the Lord. So here's a man who swings between servile submission on the one hand and a crazy optimism on the other, between despair in defeat and derision of his enemies. He's in a mess. And he came under pressure from some court officials, and he gave in to them. He was persuaded to imprison Jeremiah. So he had no backbone, he was scared. And yet at the same time he feels no shame in asking Jeremiah, chapter 37, verse 3, if he can pray on their behalf, pray to the Lord for us. I've just thrown you in prison, but say a word for us anyway. And later, after Jeremiah had been cast in the prison, Zedekiah comes and questions him secretly about getting a word from the Lord. That's in verse 17. You know, this Zedekiah, I was reading some notes about him, and he's been called the king with a neck problem. He stiffened his neck. And yet it was so flexible it seemed to bend in every direction at the same time. He was hard of heart but unstable. He was fearful, he was selfish, and totally unreliable. I don't know if that's why the Babylonians made him king. But if it is, it didn't work. Because in the end he rebelled against them and ended up having to watch his children being slaughtered and having his eyes put out before he was taken captive to Babylon. So what was Jeremiah doing while all this was going on? Well, he was just proclaiming the word of the Lord as he had done before. Chapter 37, 16 and 17. When Jeremiah had come to the dungeon cells and remained there many days, King Zedekiah sent for him and received him. The king questioned him secretly in his house and said, "Is there any word from the Lord?" Jeremiah said, "Yes." "What is it?" "You shall be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon." What I've always been telling you. Nothing new, it's the same word. And so in spite of his circumstances, Jeremiah was doing what he'd been called to do and what he'd been doing all through, speaking the truth. Considering the behavior of the king, the plots of court officials, the deaf ears of the people, it's a wonder that he did keep going, isn't it? But an even greater wonder is that God didn't remove him from the people. He kept him in post. And I wondered about that. Why did God not give him permission to leave? Why did God keep him there? And I've come to the conclusion that it has something to do with Jeremiah's buying that field and prophesying of a new covenant, that it's as if God is intent on pledging his presence and his grace and his favor to a people who were his by promise, if not by affection. They didn't love him, but he was not prepared to give them up. They despised not only Jeremiah, but the God who had sent him to them. And yet, he was not prepared to remove his word from them. And if you think about that, they went into exile. And if you read the book of Ezekiel and so on, you'll see that even in exile, men like Ezekiel preached the word to the exiles. So there was this unbroken ministry of God to his people, even at times of national crisis. Another thing that occurs to me about this is that the situation was critical because from a human perspective, I mean, if you looked at the situation on the ground, you'd have to come to the conclusion that God's plan was under critical threat. How on earth could God work out his promises in this horrible mess? Would his covenant promises ever come to fruition? But you see, just as God commanded Jeremiah to buy his relative's field as a sign that one day fields and vineyards shall be bought again in this land, so God was now saying to Judah, by Jeremiah's presence there, if you can break my covenant with the day and my covenant with the night. In other words, if God's ordination of day and night can be broken, so that day and night will not come at the appointed time, then also my covenant with David, my servant, may be broken. What's he saying? He's saying there's no chance that I'm going to give up on my promises. You can read those words in chapter 33, verse 19. There was no chance that God was going to break his promises. And we have to say that this wonderful confirmation of his promises that God gave to his people through Jeremiah the prophet in no way excused their rebellion. All it does is to speak of the grace of God. And it reminds me of those words in Romans chapter 6. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? It's almost as if these people in Israel were multiplying their sins in order to prove that God is faithful. But it doesn't do it. It doesn't work that way. God is faithful because he is God. Thirdly, an imprisoned prophet. Pharaoh came out of Egypt and advanced on the Babylonian army. The Babylonians retreated. It was a tactical retreat. Pharaoh Necho went back to Egypt and didn't come out again. Well, at that moment, Jeremiah thought this is a good time to go and get my field. So he's on his way out of the city, and a sentry gets him and takes him to the officials. They beat him and put him in prison. After many days, Zedekiah sends for him, seeking this word from the Lord. We noted the outcome of that. The word he got was that the Babylonians would get them. At that time, Jeremiah remonstrated with the king. You know, what have I done to you to deserve this? You're imprisoning me, and I've told you the truth. What about those false prophets? What have you done with them? Where are they right now? And then he confirms that it would be better to surrender and save your life than to resist and lose it. But all of that was treasonable talk, and these enemies of his paid for his blood. Zedekiah caved in. He said, he's in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you. I can't stand up to you, Lord. You're just too much for me. And so he was consigned then to this cistern with mud in the bottom. But an Ethiopian named Ebed-Melech rescued him, and he was put back in the court of the guard. So Jeremiah was out of the way. At least it would keep him quiet. First in the prison, then in the cistern, and then back in the prison. Peace at last. When I was thinking about this, something about George Whitfield, the preacher, came to mind. Before he left England to come over here to preach the gospel, he was causing such a ruckus at home that they didn't know how to keep him quiet. And they thought, I know what, let's make him a bishop. That'll keep him quiet. Well, it didn't keep him quiet. And he didn't become a bishop either. They didn't keep Jeremiah quiet either. Once more the king sends for him. I'll ask you a question. Hide nothing from me. Tell me everything. Jeremiah knows about his neck problem. If I tell you, you'll certainly put me to death. If I give you counsel, you will not listen, he says. So if there was ever a moment for him to be quiet, just to save his own neck, it was now. But what does he say? Exactly the same. If you surrender, then your life will be spared, and this city will not be burned. You and your house will live, but if you do not surrender, you shall not escape from their hand. More of the same. What great consistency. I don't know if I would have had the courage to speak those words time after time after time. The king was scared that if he surrendered, he'd be handed over to other people of Judah who had already defected to the king, and he thought they might ill-treat him. Jeremiah assured him that he would be treated well, that the king would preserve his life. Only trust the word of the Lord. So Jeremiah remained a prisoner until the day when Jerusalem finally fell. But instead of obeying him, Zedekiah did a runner. He tried to escape. He was caught, he was tried, his children were executed before his eyes, he was blinded, he was taken away. Jeremiah, in contrast, was allowed to remain in Jerusalem under Babylonian protection. Exactly what he said would happen. Until he was forcibly removed to Egypt by his fellow countrymen. So here is a man who has to declare destruction. A man who knows that the situation is past recall. A man who has very little of comfort to say to the immediate situation. A man who points to the distant future for comfort and consolation. And yet a man who was required to stay in post throughout that whole period. To maintain, if you like, the means of grace to a disobedient people.